Michael Anton is the author of The Stakes, America at the Point of No Return, the Flight 93 election, and also The Suit, a Machiavellian approach to men's style. He's also a trained French chef and a very good friend of mine. Over the next hour, you get to see Michael Anton in the kitchen talking about what he loves.
Okay, I'm trying a little experiment here. My friend and sort of lifestyle blogger, David Mirepoix, suggested I make a video of this project, so I'm going to try it, send it to him if it works.
What you see in the entire video is the making of a demi-glace from beginning to end. You could make a demi-glace out of almost anything, out of almost any sort of bone. You can make it. The most common is beef or veal. Probably veal is the most common in restaurants. Beef may be the most common at home because beef bones are more readily available. But any bones will work. Anything you can make into a stock, you can then make into a demi-glace. In a way, it's the pinnacle of French cooking. Escoffier calls stocks the fond de cuisine, the foundations of cooking. They're the first recipes he gives in his famous book, the Guide culinaire, which is the Bible of French cooking. And from there, he builds the sauces, of which only two are really stock-based, and those are velouté and espagnole, and espagnole becomes demi-glace. And then once you have your demi-glace, I didn't do anything to it. I just served it because it conveys a wonderful flavor. But you can, from there are all kinds of derivative sauces. Sauce Robert, made from demi-glace, which is considered like a pork sauce. The orange sauce that goes with duck. There's just millions of things that you can do with it. Many of them regularized in the Escoffier book, or The Saucier's Apprentice by Raymond Sokolov, which lists at least 80 to 100 variations, things that you can do with demi-glace.
This is day one, step one of a lamb demi-glace. So here's my crummy oven in my rental home. Here's your roasting pan. That's 4 pounds of basically the cheapest cut you can get, as bony as possible. So this is a little neck and a little shoulder. It's in a 400-degree oven, just alone. Cut it up into pretty big pieces because this is going to have to be on the stove for 8 to 10 to 12 hours. And you roast it until it's just thoroughly brown. So we've got a long way to go. This is a little too light. We're going to close the oven, put it back in there, let it keep roasting for a while.
I'll tell you something about the dish. So I served this with rack of lamb. I had 10 total people at the table, so I had 5 racks of lamb. A rule of thumb being a half rack per person is about right. So what is the rack? It's that rib section of the lamb. It has a full rack altogether should have 8 ribs, and they're French. That is to say, at the very bottom of the bone, this is just a presentation thing, you don't have to do it, but you French the bone to expose some of the bone. It just looks a little bit prettier. Another point, the rack will have on the top a very thin layer of fat, a fat cap. You want to score that, which means make very shallow, parallel, sort of diamond-shaped cuts in the fat, so that when you cook the lamb, some of that fat renders out and also moistens the meat. And another highly recommended tip is, with any cut of meat, but especially red meat, salt and pepper it, season it in advance, 24 hours in advance. And this does 2 things fundamentally. One is it really deepens the flavor because the salt just has more time to get in there and wake up the flavors. The other thing is salt pulls moisture out of meat. So if you salt something on the counter, you leave it there for 20 minutes, that's in a way the worst way to do it because all that water will collect. And when you put it in the pan, it's the water that's going to make it stick. If you salt it in advance overnight, it'll release a lot of that. So you lose the moisture, A, and B, you make your food stick. Not good. If you season it overnight, that moisture will come out initially, but most of it, maybe not all of it, but most of it will get reabsorbed. The point is, though, you'll have a dry cut that you can roast, which means it's not going to stick. Okay, so having done that, I bought the lamb, Frenched the lamb, scored the fat, seasoned it overnight. When you're ready to cook it, I did it. You can cook this kind. You can grill it. There's a million ways you can do it. This is the way I did it. For that dinner. I seared it in a hot pan, an all-clad stainless, not a non-stick. I used a combination of butter and oil. Now, people will say, well, the reason you add oil to butter is to raise the smoke point of the butter. That means the point at which the milk solids burn. That's actually a myth. That doesn't actually happen. The milk solids, if you get the pan too hot, will eventually burn no matter what. It just gives it a nicer flavor combination than I think butter or oil alone does. So I used a little olive oil, a little butter. I dropped in a smashed garlic clove and some fresh rosemary and some fresh thyme into the butter to flavor the butter, because while you're searing the lamb, you get a big flat spoon. You want to constantly baste it. That does two things. It conveys a lot of the flavorings to the lamb, so you're just scooping up liquid fat with the spoon and pouring it over, just baste. It conveys a lot of flavor into the lamb, but another thing it does is, the part touching the pan is obviously always the part that's cooking, and so the part on the upper part isn't really cooking because it's not exposed to heat, but you're cooking the lamb more evenly by basting it, because that fat is not only conveying flavor, it's conveying heat, which is surrounding the cut as you cook it. So I seared it all off. You want to start on the fat side, let some of that fat render out and become part of the liquid that you baste with. On the rib side, on the front, there's a sort of bulge that won't get captured if you just do the top and the bottom, so you kind of need to stand the lamb up to make sure you get that face of the rib, I should say, or something like that. And then the sides. Okay, and once it's brown all over, you put it on your wire rack, and we're going to cook it in the oven later. Now, the reason I think this method works is for a large party. Like I said, I had 5 racks. Now, I do have a big 14-inch pan. I could probably do 2 of them at once in that pan, but it didn't seem to be a point. So I just used the 12-inch, which can only do 1. So you sear it, and you got another one to sear, and you got 4 more. So that takes a while. Then what do you do? Well, you have them laid out on a cookie sheet with a wire rack. Why do you have the wire rack? Same principle, in a way, a similar principle as basting, because when the lamb goes into the oven to finish cooking, it's hot air is going to cook it, but you want that hot air to surround the lamb, and the wire rack sort of lifts it up off the cookie sheet and allows some air to get under it. It's the same principle of the wire rack on your roasting pan that you use for your Thanksgiving turkey or your Christmas roast or whatever. So once the lamb is all seared and laid out on the rack, I throw that rack in a 400 degree, 350, it was 350, in a 350 degree oven, and I just constantly test for doneness. And I do this in 2 ways. One is, you can tell just by pressing with tongs or a wooden spoon on the bulgiest, the thickest part of the lamb. If it's very spongy, you know it isn't done. A super experienced cook can simply tell by touch. If you're the grill man at a restaurant, or the saucier, which means in the French brigade system, the saucier is not so much the person who makes sauces, but it's the person who makes the hot entrees that come with the sauce. You will know. You'll get so much experience that you will know from touch when something is done or to what degree of doneness. I don't trust myself that much, especially not with lamb, which I think has to be cooked precisely. I think undercooked lamb is chewy and unappetizing, and overcooked lamb is just gray and drab. So I wanted to get a perfect medium rare rosy pink, and I need to do that with an insta-read thermometer. So when the lamb gets to about 110, 115, the rack comes out. And what you're looking for is about 120, 125, but there's something called carryover cooking. So you've heated these things up incredibly, these cuts of meat, they're gotten really hot. They don't just become cool when you take them out of the oven, they're still hot. And that residual heat in the lamb itself will continue to cook the lamb for at least 5, maybe 10 minutes. And actually, the bigger the cut of something, the more carryover cooking there is. So you roast a whole leg of lamb. Thomas Keller recommends letting that rest for half an hour. My family tends to make a prime rib for Christmas dinner. A 5-6 rib prime rib needs a rest of at least an hour and can rest for 45 minutes, no problem. And the longer it rests, the less, when you finally cut it, the less the delicious juice will flow out onto the carving board.
This is our herb bouquet or bouquet garni. That is thyme, parsley, peppercorn, a couple of cloves, and a bay leaf in there. This is optional, but I always like to have mushrooms. Usually you use mushroom trimming. So if you use your mushrooms, you peel them, you stem them, you'd save the stems, the trimmings, and throw them in the stock. I didn't have any trimmings. Mushrooms are cheap. I just bought some mushrooms and cut them up. Again, pretty big pieces because this stock is going to be on the flame. Brown stock, typically you can simmer for 12 hours. I don't know if I'm going to get 12 hours by the time I got to strain it and go to bed, but we'll get at least 8. This is what's called the Mirepoix. Celery, onion, carrot, also cut into very big pieces, and tomato. They say concassé, which should be very tiny little pieces, but I just cut it into big chunks. This is just Roma tomatoes, and that also goes in to the liquid, but we will get to that phase later. For now, we're waiting for the bones to thoroughly brown, which takes 45 minutes to an hour. So here's another trick I learned. This is called an onion brulee, which basically means burnt onion. Normally you would cut an onion, not the way this is, from tip to root. but through its equator and put each half down. But I had this half onion saved. Another thing I learned in culinary school, never throw anything out. So I made a risotto the other night, used half an onion. You wrap this tightly in saran wrap, put it in the fridge, it'll be fine. And save it for another use. So this is a perfect use for it. It's got a cut side. You put it in this pan or a flat top, or if you have one, a plancha. I don't. I just have this little 30-inch gas stove. Flat surface, and just roast it until it's completely burnt. This is a trick I learned from the inimitable Chef X, my favorite culinary school instructor, a true French taskmaster. But it sounds like it should be terrible, but it isn't. You drop this into your stock. That is the next phase, by the way, that we were making. In making a demi-glace, first you make stock, then you make sauce espagnole, then you combine the stock and the sauce espagnole and reduce to consistency, and you have demi-glace. But the first phase is the stock, and that takes quite a while. A lot of roasting time of the vegetables, of the bones, the onion, and all of it, and then a lot of simmering time on the stove. But for now, we're just going to get this onion, and I'll show it to you when it's nice and black on the bottom, and you'll see what it looks like. Okay, so these are not finished. They still need more time. I am turning them so that they will brown more evenly. Sure, my oven isn't. It is at 450. They seem to be browning rather slowly. And you see all of this stuff that releases. Most of that's just liquid water that'll go in your stock. We'll deglaze the pan after this, but I'll get to that when I get to it. Yeah, this still has a long way to go. You're seeing some real browning in a few pieces, but most of them are much too light. So just got to go back in that 450 oven for more browning. Okay, our onion brulee is done. Just want to show you what it looks like. Just charred black. So in general in cooking, burnt is bad. This is one of the rare exceptions. I would not have known about it had I not gone to what was then called the French Culinary Institute in Lower Manhattan and learned from a great teacher named Chef X, short for Xavier, who not only was a great teacher but was born in Corsica and had come to America and had been a cook on some of the great restaurants in New York, French restaurants, including the late lamented La Côte Basque on West 55th Street, which if any of you are literary types out there and know anything about Truman Capote's unfinished novel Answered Prayers, a chapter of that novel is named after La Côte Basque, where he describes a sort of gossipy lunch where he tells all the secrets of these society matrons who had been some of his best sources of material, and they never spoke to him again, which may be one of the reasons why he never finished the book. Anyway, there's your onion brulee. We're just going to let it sit until we're ready to put it in the liquid. It's fine just sitting there on the stove. You can also see, as I said, the pan will get gunked up with black carbon. That comes off with steel wool and a little elbow grease. Doesn't hurt the pan, doesn't make it look better, but the pan will be fine. Okay, as you can see, we're getting good color here. I don't think we're quite there yet, so I have just turned it a bit to get the parts that look a little light on the facing up, not facing the pan. This is one of the reasons why recipes are difficult and not always trustworthy. That is to say, if I were just to say to you, well, roast the bones if you look this up in a book, it would say roast the bones for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. It would give you a number. That may work, it may not work. You basically have to do it by eye. When it looks dark enough, it's ready. So you want very brown and caramelized all over without burning. And the color adds to the flavor of the stock, and it adds to the color of the stock. If this is a brown stock, you want this stock to be pretty dark. You can't, at least not that I'm aware of, make white stock with lamb, but let's say we had veal bones or chicken bones. If we wanted to make a white stock for a different use, we would take the bones, blanch them in water, basically boil them in water first, and a lot of impurities and scum comes out, floats to the surface. You skim that off with the skimmer, and then you make your stock without browning the bones, and the stock is lighter in color, lighter in flavor. Obviously, we are making brown stock because we're going to make a demi-glace, which is it's not actually one of the mother sauces of France, but it's derivative from one of the mother sauces called espagnole. We'll get to that stage later. But I'm having people over tomorrow and making rack of lamb. And so a lamb demi-glace is the perfect accompaniment. I haven't made lamb stock in a while, so I needed some. So that's why we're doing this. Okay, this is going back in the oven for a little bit. I think we're close. We're 5-10 minutes away, maybe. Okay, we're ready to add the veg, the Mirepoix. I still think this could use a bit more browning, but remember, it's going to brown longer. So if you're going to put your vegetables in, there they go. There's fat from the lamb that has, I didn't mention this, but when you usually these bony cuts are fairly lean. There might be some fat in them, but you're going to need to, when you put the bones in when they're raw before they go in the oven, you preheat the oven to 450. Obviously, you don't want to put this in a cold oven. You should pour a little oil over it and just rub the bones with your hands to make sure they get coated, and then they'll release some of the residual fat. Anyway, there'll be plenty of fat in the bottom of the pan to roast all these vegetables. So you just dump them in there, stir them around, make sure they get a little coating of the fat, and then the pan goes back in the oven for further roasting. And again, we're looking for the same thing. We want to see some color on these vegetables, and that's when we know we're ready to move to the next stage. Okay, same drill as before. Take them out, use your tool, wooden spoon, whatever, toss them around a little bit. Make sure you get some even browning. We don't have nearly enough color on these vegetables yet. Although, as you can see, some of them are getting, the carrots are getting a little color there from the side that's been down against the roasting pan. The lamb's looking very good. Just a little bit of extra time. One thing which we'll get to shortly is you see all these particles that stick to the roasting pan. Those are called, if my pronunciation is correct, the souks, spelled S-U-C or S-U-C-S in the plural. It's good flavor. We're going to want to get all of that and put it in the stock, and I will show you how we do that at the appropriate time, but for now we need to keep on roasting these vegetables. Okay, our veg is getting pretty brown. See, the onions are quite brown. The carrots are getting close. Now's when we put in the garlic, and the reason, first of all, this is you leave the skin on and you smash it with the flat of a knife, back of a knife, something like that, a wooden spoon, whatever. The reason we put the garlic in late is it's pretty powerful and imparts a lot of flavor. It doesn't need much time to cook, so you just stir it in and put this back in. Now we're just a couple of minutes away, and then we're gonna do the tomato paste, but we'll get to that in a sec. Okay, we are nearing the end of time in the oven. Next step is tomato paste. Now, some recipes have you just not use it. Some recipes just say dump it into the sauce with the liquid. I can hear Chef X's voice in the background. I won't try to attempt his French accent saying, cook your tomato paste. He was very insistent about that. It had to be cooked. So I use this stuff, the stuff in the paste, better than the can because it's just like a toothpaste tube. You can put it back in the fridge when you don't use it. I kind of eyeball it. I'm just going to squeeze some out here. Okay, you want, the equivalent of like a tablespoon. I'm going to need some more of this tomorrow for the second stage, the Espanol stage, and then you stir it around. Okay, make sure it kind of coats everything. Gets, you don't have to be precise. All of this is going to get strained out. You're not going to eat any of it anyway. There's a lot of fat down there. We'll discuss later what we do with it. I think I'm going to give it another, maybe just one more squeeze here. A little more in there. And this goes back in the oven, and once this cooks for a couple of minutes, we are ready to take this out, put it in the stock pot, and cover it with liquid. Okay, everything's ready to go in the pot. Oven's off, so just take your tongue and take the big pieces, just put them directly in there. That's the easiest way. A lot of these are heavy, they've got some bones, you don't want to tip up the pan and dump them everywhere. The question of the fat is a tricky one. That is to say, you don't want a lot of fat in your stock, but there's all kinds of flavory goodness in here that you don't want to discard either. I tend not to be super scrupulous about fat because there's an easy way to get it all out at the end of the process, which is once its stock has been strained several times, you simply put it in the fridge and the fat will solidify, come to the top, form almost a disc like a skating rink, and then you just take it out. Now, Chef X would definitely yell at me for that. He would say that you should be skimming your stock constantly as you make it. In the olden days, when in France, a kitchen brigade would have dozens of people back there, and I had no problem with finding the labor to do it. Chef X, I remember him saying at one point that for 2 years, his job was just to skim the fat. They would have so many stock pots going at once, and he would just sit there and skim the fat. Basically take a small ladle, collect the fat in little pools, put it in another pot, and then skim the fat off the other pot because you inevitably take up some liquid when you skim the fat to try to save as much liquid as you could. And he would just do this back and forth. And I thought it reminded me of 2 years skimming the fat. I immediately thought of Richard Henry Dana's famous book, 2 Years Before the Mast. It's a pretty miserable way to make a living, I think, just skimming fat. Anyway, so we want to get all of those souks up. So I am going to pour out some of this fat. I'm going to strain it. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to show you that, but I'll do my best. That's just not good, but I want to catch as much of that good stuff in there as possible. So I'm gonna hand off the phone. Just want to get rid of as much of this as we can, right? Catch the oniony stuff. Not sure there's a use for lamb fat. If this were like goose or duck or something, I would definitely find it useful. Now, these onions and things that are still in there, get them out. You know, use your slotted spoon. You want them, get them into the pot. Okay. Now, first we're gonna take this pot. We're gonna cover it with water, just cold water. Hot water doesn't really matter, and you don't want to fill it all the way because we're going to put water in that roasting pan and use that to deglaze the souk at the bottom, and then put that water in because that's just extra flavor. Now, some of this you can see there is a little bit of scum in there, and I will skim that off. I'll show you how to do that later, but we don't have to worry about that right now. So let's get the water like up to the rivets of the pot, and then we'll put it on the stove and get the heat going. So lift this up. That's actually not hot. I don't know why I'm using pot holders because the pot is room temp, but what are you gonna do? So a general rule that I learned is whatever the size of your pot, half the amount in bones. So this is an 8-quart pot. I used 4 pounds of bones. You know, in a professional kitchen, everything would be metric. So it'd be liters and kilograms and so on. But you know, this is not actually a huge amount of stock. I mean, if you're going to make stock, my recommendation typically is if you have freezer space, make a ton of it because it's not really more work for you to do more volume. Yes, the chopping time is slightly higher, but this stuff is very, very useful. My problem is I make so much stock, I don't have a lot of freezer space. So 8 quarts will be absolutely plenty of stock. You don't get 8 quarts, by the way, from an 8-quart pot because there's a lot of solids in there displacing liquid, but this will be more than enough for me to make my demi-glace and be ready for tomorrow. So now we're going to put some water in the roasting pan. Let's just give it one more tip to see if we can get some fat out of there. No, it's not even worth trying. So just want enough to cover the bottom of that pan. This is very similar to the way you would make, say, turkey gravy on Thanksgiving, right? At least, I don't know, if you do it the old-fashioned way. Which my mother insists that we do it the old-fashioned way. I'd actually made, you know, turkey demi-glace for her, and she thought it was ridiculous and didn't like it and said it ruined Thanksgiving dinner. So we never did that again. So it's on the stove, the heat is on, okay? And the heat will help you deglaze the pan. Another benefit to doing this is it cleans the pan. I mean, it makes the roasting pan easier to clean. But all of these little particles are flavor that you want. And again, the sauce is going to be strained multiple times, so any gunky bits will not end up in your finished product. So don't worry anything about that. This has taken some time, which I didn't tape it all, but I pretty much, the bottom's basically clean. You just use your, I don't know what you call this thing, a wooden spatula, I guess. It's just sort of a scraper and it doesn't harm the metal. And the bottom's pretty much clean. You can see all that stuff floating in there. All of that's good. It'll impart flavor. Here's our stock. Nice dark color. It'll get more color as it simmers all day. Note too that I have the burner on high. That's just because if you put it on simmer, you want the stock to simmer for a long time. But if you start out it on simmer, it'll never get to a simmer. You need heavy heat to get it up to temp, but you never want it to boil. This is why you can't walk away from the pot for a while, because you need to just continually turn it down. So I'm seeing some movements and bubbles, so I'm turning it from high down to, let's say, medium high. And now I'm going to pick up the roasting pan and pour that into the big pan. So you obviously don't want to overflow the pan. I don't mind if it's quite at the top because you're going to lose liquid as you simmer this all day. So that's just almost perfect. Okay, here we go. Now we have some other aromatics that go in: tomato, mushroom, and the herbs. And plus, actually, I'm going to drop this in now. Here's our onion brulee. In you go. Our mushrooms, Oops, it also remember to turn unused burners off. Mushrooms go in. Tomato, they call this concasse. I didn't exactly cut it concasse. I don't think that was necessary, but just dump them in there. And I'll wait on the herbs. The pot is a little high. You know, make sure you use your spoon to dunk everything. Yeah, we'll wait until this reduces a bit. I think otherwise it's going to overflow further. Oh well, that's one of the dangers of stock making. Okay, so here's our pot. Still pretty high. I've been in the liquid. That is, I turned down the burner. It's not on a simmer yet, but what you're looking for, they call it at the Culinary Institute of America, which I did not attend, but whose books I have read and repeatedly consulted. They say you're looking for a, quote, lazy bubble, unquote. So this initial bubble that you see at the top, a lot of that is some of that scum we saw. When the pot's a little lower, I will skim it off. I'm not going to do that now because I'll just spill liquid all over the top of the stove. And also, when the pot's a little lower, I will put in the herbs, which are over here. It doesn't matter. This is going to be on the stove for so long that it'll suck the flavor out of those herbs, no problem. So it doesn't matter if they go in late. In fact, some recipes say to wait and put the herbs in much later. I just do want to address one question here, which some may be asking, gee, this takes a lot of time and it uses all this material, and isn't it wasteful? And what do you end up with anyway? Well, in fact, the beginnings of this process, the stock making, the sauce making process, is the opposite of wasteful. It's an attempt to use absolutely everything. So, nobody knows exactly where this came from. You can go back into the early 20th century, about 200 years ago into the early 19th century, and look at the writings of Antoine Carême. I also recommend a really wonderful book called Dirt by Bill Buford, in which is part chef memoir, but in which he also does a lot of research and tries to find the origin of certain recipes. Anyway, the point is, supposing you lived on a farm, or you're buying meat, you'd be buying whole animals, butchering them yourself, or your cooks would be butchering them, say you were some aristocrat, and you wanted to get the most out of them. And the original point of stock was to find a way to use bones and other inedible parts to extract flavor. Also, in a professional kitchen, they'd be doing tons of veg prep for different dishes. Like I said, there would be mushroom trimmings. They wouldn't be using whole mushrooms. They wouldn't be necessarily using whole carrots, because there'd be carrot trimmings from all the different fancy ways they prepare a carrot to look pretty. My favorite being tournée, where you take it and you use a little bird's beak pear and you cut it into the shape of a football, which I'm not going to demonstrate now. So all that stuff would be saved and used for a purpose. So this is a way to minimize waste, to actually get something out of every part of the food that you're buying using. The late Anthony Bourdain used to say this was a golden rule in cooking and restaurant cooking, but also sort of from peasant times in Europe, that you had to use everything because you weren't rich enough to throw anything away. So you had to come up. Many of the recipes stem from basic necessity. We are coming up with ways to use parts that are, otherwise we wouldn't know what to do with. And these recipes are sort of ingenious ways to find ways to do that. So yes, it is a lot of time, and it is, although most of the time the pot just sits on the stove and simmers, and you don't have to do anything. But it's supposed to be the opposite of wasteful. And if I had been planning ahead and made certain dishes, I would have all of these trimmings. I just don't happen to have them at the time. But I often do have mushroom trimmings and carrot trimmings and other kinds of trimmings on hand. Notice that I had half an onion saved in the fridge, which is what I used for the brulee. So there's the answer to that. We can maybe revisit this topic later, because at the end, all you are getting is a stock and a sauce, and therefore not something that makes a meal. But I'll address that shortly. So the pot continues to burble there, but liquid's still up pretty high. It's looking good. I keep turning the heat down. Don't need it this high. It never boiled, which is good. I also wanted to clarify, I hope my friend Dave does not take offense when I called him a lifestyle blogger earlier. What I meant was, he does a lot on politics, he does write a lot on politics, but he doesn't limit himself to politics, and I think that's one of the reasons his personality comes through. And his Substack and his Twitter is fun to read, because there's a lot of other stuff on there, music and food and exercise and all kinds of things beyond just the political controversies of the day. And it would be much more boring, and Dave would be much more boring if he only talked about politics, but he doesn't. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's got such a big following. And this was his idea, broaden it out. Let's not be talking about current events all the time, because first of all, they're somewhat depressing, and second of all, it gets dull. Okay, now we're going to try a little careful skimming. So you see, what I'm going for is this sort of foamy scum. You want to capture as little of the actual food particles in there as possible, because that's where you're getting your flavor from. But you don't have to be crazy about it. This gunky stuff will just cloud the stock in the end. And, color isn't everything, especially not for the home cook. I mean, a restaurant chef, Chef X would berate me for not being sufficiently concerned with the color of my stock. If I were going to use this and make a consommé, which is essentially, you take what they call a wrap, it's some ground beef and a bunch of vegetables and egg whites and things, and you fine the stock. What the consommé does is it simultaneously captures all cloudy particles in the stock and tries to replace whatever flavor you take out by taking out some of those particles with the flavor that's in the wrap. And you end up with an extremely clear broth. If you've ever had it before, it's see-through. The Culinary Institute of America famously says, for consommé to be considered properly made, you have to be able to spot the date on a dime at the bottom of a 10-quart stock pot. If you can't do that, it isn't clear enough to be called consommé. So I'm not making consommé, I'm just making stock, and therefore I'm a little bit less concerned about the cloudiness of the stock, whether it's perfectly clear or not, but you do want to get as much of that gunk out. So you can see now it's a lot cleaner up at the top. Now, had we blanched these bones, you would have seen all kinds of gunk and stuff come out. We didn't blanch them, so that the stuff is still in there. It got brown. It will add flavor. At the end of the day, though, that's what you want for a brown stock that's going to be made into sauce. So watch the top of the pot. You'll see what I mean by a lazy bubble. There's almost no motion, but if you watch long enough, at some point, you'll just see a bubble rise up. That's what you're looking for, that level of low simmer. Now, I still have to tend this pot until I get the heat turned all the way down. It's not all the way down, it's somewhere near medium-low. I'm getting close, but I'm not gonna walk away and start doing other things and not thinking about the pot until I get to that point. And I see some little more foam that I could skim off. And you don't have to be obsessive about this, but it helps to get off as much as possible. Like I said, if you're making white chicken stock that you're gonna use for chicken soup or a broth, you would boil those chicken bones and a ton of gray goop would come up. You'd skim all of that out before you added your vegetables, none of which you'd brown and stuff like that. So another thing to say is, I'm making lamb stock, which is unusual. Far more common is chicken stock, beef stock. Restaurants, especially fancy French restaurants, like to use veal stock because you get a neutral flavor. You get all the collagen from the bones and all the things that give a stock size or body, which is good. It doesn't taste like thin water. It's not concentrated unless you reduce it to be concentrated. The stock should be liquid, but it'll have more body than regular water. The reason they like to use veal stock is because the flavor is so neutral, you can apply almost any flavor to it. So if you're in a busy kitchen, you're cooking 3 or 4 different roasts, meats, sautés, things like that, you can use that veal stock and add different flavorings to it, make different derivative sauces, and it will take on more or less the flavor of the dish. Lamb stock tastes like lamb, and you can only use it with lamb. It doesn't have any other applications. That's why it's much less often made, except in a kitchen that constantly serves it, or as a special occasion kind of thing. I'm going to make this into a lamb demi-glace to be served with lamb. Whatever's left over, I will freeze and save it the next time I have an appropriate cut of lamb. But this is not something that you could, you wouldn't want to use on a pork or beef or veal or whatever. It just won't work. The gamey flavor of lamb is very, very distinctive. And so this is why this doesn't get made very much. I think even in professional kitchens probably don't make it very much. If you have the famous French laundry cookbook published all the way back in the late 90s, I think, Keller describes how they do sauces at the French laundry, and he makes a lot of stock, but he doesn't have the space, he says, in the kitchen, either on the stoves or in storage, to store all the various different kinds of stock. So he has this notion of quick sauces. I encourage you to read that section of the book. It's quite hilarious because the word quick means something very different to Thomas Keller than it does to you or to I. Granted, the process of his quick sauces is a lot quicker than making a full demi-glace as we're doing now, but I having done it myself a few times, it's not really all that quick, but it does make a pretty good sauce. Okay, we're going to turn it down a little further, get a little more of this scum, a little more of this foamy gunk. This stops coming up after a while, or it comes up a lot less, so you don't have to, in Chef X's world, you would be over this pot all day, but you don't have to in my world. Actually, I will say this, at the restaurant and at the culinary school where I went, they had something called steam jacket kettles, which are these gigantic pots mounted on the floor that sides are heated by steam. And they would make huge amounts of stock at once, fill the steam jacket kettle. They actually had spouts at the bottom so that you just drain it out the bottom. Because they use so much stock at these restaurants. And they would start this overnight. They would start it, get this pot on as they shut down for the day and go home and leave the stuff on all day or overnight. And nobody was there skimming it constantly. So as much as I know that is the proper French way, I also know certain French chefs didn't exactly adhere to it. And if they didn't, in all cases, I don't think you have to either. Another thing is just you want to, some hot water, clean your skimmer, just turn it around through the back, let the water get rid of all that gunk, because otherwise, if you're not cleaning it as you skim, you're just taking stuff out and putting it right back in. And we're getting that lazy bubble, so it's looking pretty good. Almost time to put in the herbs. Again, what we have in here are loose peppercorns, 1 bay leaf. I highly recommend Morton and Bassett. There's no better bay leaf I've ever found, at least not a grocery store variety. They are expensive, it's about $10 a bottle, but they're just that much better. Some thyme, which I had in the garden outside, a little herb garden, and parsley. Always buy flat leaf parsley. This is known as your bouquet garni or herb bouquet. An older French way that I might have done had I had some leek is you take the flat green end of a leek and you make a little pouch and you stuff all this stuff in there and you tie it with kitchen twine. You get a little extra flavor from the leek. It looks cool, and it's also just easy to remove and discard. But that's not such a problem with this, as you'll see. This is all going to be strained, so you can just put this stuff in there loose, and it's going to go through a couple of different types of strainers, which we will see later, and it'll catch everything and get rid of it with no problem. So, just a couple of remarks on what this stuff is for. A normal stock, you can use for a lot of things. You can make consomme, you can make soup broth. I mean, what is chicken broth? But in a sense, chicken stock. Chicken soup is made from chicken broth. There's all kinds of ways you can use it as a soup base, as a sauce base, also as a braising liquid. So one thing you could do with lamb stock is a cut of lamb that it needs to be braised, that is sort of cooked, submerged in liquid or half submerged in liquid, because it's a tougher cut that won't roast or saute well. Something like a shank or a lamb shoulder, things like that absolutely have to be braised. You can braise it in anything. You can braise it in water, you can braise it in wine, you can braise it in beef stock, veal stock. But if you braise it in lamb stock, you're going to really massively intensify the lamb flavor. So that's one delicious thing that you can do with your lamb stock. You don't have to make this all the way into a demi-glace if you don't want to. There are other ways you can use this as a sauce base. I think I'll talk about those a little later. But at this point, our pot is more or less ready. I am going to risk putting the herbs in here. Hopefully you see that they sort of rest on the top there. I push them down a little bit. They're not going to take up much volume. Hopefully nothing spills. There's a few more little pieces in here, and all those black peppercorns that just go in loose. So in go the herbs, and the hard part's over. Now you just wait for it. So traditionally, the time of stocks depends on the type of stock. So a vegetable stock, which is made solely of vegetables, only needs to be on the fire for 45 minutes to an hour. Same with a fish stock or a fish fumet, maybe an hour and a half. A typical white chicken stock, because the bones are soft, you'll get most of the flavor out of the bones in, let's say, 2 hours. Brown chicken stock, any brown stock takes longer than a white stock, is about maybe 4 hours. But where the big brown sauces, beef, veal, lamb, game, venison, these kinds of things, they need more time. The typical time is 8 to 12 hours. And you can walk away, just check the pot every once in a while, make sure it's not, sometimes pots stay on the heat for a long time, the residual heat builds up and the simmer starts to get too fast, then you want to be able to turn it down. You don't want to see no motion at the surface. If you see no motion, you got to turn the heat up. But other than that, you can go about the rest of your day while your stock simmers. And the reason you want it to take a long time is because these larger animals, heavier animals, their bones are very, very dense, and it just takes a ton of time to extract flavor. It's not a quick process the way it is with chicken, or especially vegetables, or fish for that matter, which tend to have very small bones. Okay, so we're at about 4 hours, so either half to a third of the way through. You can see it's still at a lazy bubble. Most of that scummy foam is gone. I've been skimming it intermittently, but as I said, less of it will come up as you go. The recommendation for a brown stock with the heavy bones like this is 8 to 12 hours. my rule of thumb is the smaller the pot, the shorter you need to go. So this is an 8 quart, it's the smallest stock pot I ever used. So I might be able to get away with 8 or 10 hours. If I was using my 20 quart pot, the biggest one I have here, I'd probably leave it on 12 hours. I'd probably start this at night and just leave it on overnight and then let it chill. Strain it and chill it in the morning. Although this is a bit of a better way, because if you could let it rest in the fridge overnight, it's very, very easy to skim the fat, and then you're all ready to go on to the espagnole phase after that. A couple points. One is that this is basically the same process no matter what type of bones you use. So beef is, as I said, beef is common, veal, pork, game, lamb. The last time I made demi-glace was with duck. Around Easter, we just saw a lot of whole ducks in the market, bought them, broke them down, confit the legs, sauteed the breasts in the pan. All of that after you make duck stock, make duck demi-glace, use that as a base for, in this case it was I always pronounce it wrong, I think it's the sauce Burgade. Anyway, it's the orange sauce, duck à l'orange. So it's the same process. One thing is, most recipes would call for you to leave out the tomatoes and the tomato paste when you're making poultry stock. I'm not exactly sure all the reasons for it, although it somehow intuitively makes sense. French cooking is pretty much the most well codified cuisine in the world. That if you consult different books, you'll find slightly different stock recipes, sauce recipes, but the similarity will be high compared to, go find 3 or 4 Italian cookbooks and look up a bolognese. And yes, there will be similarities, but it's going to be a lot further from identical that you will find for French stock cooking, especially the mother sauces and the stocks. Stop there for a sec. Another thing I forgot to mention when I dumped the herbs in is that I had a couple of cloves in there. They give a nice little extra dimension and spice, but they're very powerful. I would use sparingly. I used 2, and you could even use 1 and you still get the flavor. I wouldn't use much more than that. But they're very good for a brown stock and sauce. I wouldn't put them in white. Another point I would make is on simmering time. If you're making beef stock, typically you're talking about the largest animal from which you'll ever get bones, and with the densest bones, really does need that long extraction time. So probably should go the full 12 hours with beef stock. Whereas it's maybe unnecessary with lamb. Certainly it's unnecessary with poultry, which has softer bones, duck or chicken. Beef stock is very useful, base for all kinds of soups and stews and braises, you name it. More useful than lamb stock. There's a lot of different applications. You could make a demi-glace straight from beef stock. As I said, the most common way to make a demi-glace in a professional kitchen would be with veal stock. It's not that easy to find veal bones. If you have a good fancy butcher around, you can usually, if you call ahead and ask for them, they'll order them, they'll get them for you. They're not just going to carry them. I do have a pretty good one around, but I still haven't made veal stock in a while. In part because I like having around, if you have the freezer space, having stock, very specific stock for very specific applications is I think the preferred way to do it. Veal stock is in a sense kind of it's not a cheat, but it is sort of a shortcut, to make the neutral flavored stock and then flavor it up after that, put some flavors in on top of it. It doesn't make the sauce bad. It actually tastes pretty good. I'm just saying, if a purist would say, if I want this sauce to be the best pairing I can with the dish that I'm serving, he would want that to be from the bones of the animal that the dish goes with. So you want a duck demi-glace with duck, a lamb demi-glace with lamb, and so on and so forth. It's a better way to do it if you have time and if you have the space to store all this after you've made it. Actually, one last point before we sign off for a few hours. I actually changed the burners. I thought, now I have a stove which at least is gas, but it's not exactly super high tech. And so the lowest that big burner, the highest butane or highest BTU burner can go, had it on a bit higher than a lazy bubble. So I moved it to a slightly weaker burner, and you do have to calibrate the flame to make sure you don't overdo it or underdo it, but that will happen sometimes with pots like this, especially as you lose some water, so the volume goes down, but also as the just the heat builds up in the pot. So keep an eye on that. Remember, you want to see some motion at the surface, but not much. The lazy bubble, just occasional little fleck of bubble, that's all you want. Okay, it's been about 8 hours. You can see that it's reduced not much, but that's because it's been on an extremely low simmer, but we've lost maybe a half, 3/4 of an inch of liquid there. So it's time to strain it. Now, we strain it with 2 devices. This thing on the right is called a china cap. The thing on the left is called a chinois. The reason is because they are conical, and whenever these names were devised, probably in the 19th or maybe even in the 18th century, they were called this because they resemble the straw hats for sun protection that Chinese agricultural workers wore. I assume both of these names are now completely anathema and can't be used anymore, but this is the way I learned them when I was actually even before I was in culinary school and in culinary school, and I haven't heard an alternative, so I'm sure these will, be denounced and we'll have to call them something else, but for now, in the profession, this is what they are known as, a china cap and a chinois. You will notice that the china cap, it has much larger holes, and the chinois is a fine mesh. Now, the china cap allows a lot of more liquid to pour through, but also allows a lot of the gunky particles to pour through. The reason why you use them both is you want to put the stock first through the china cap so that the maximum amount of good stuff gets through. If you were to try to dump the stock through the chinois, the fine mesh sieve, there would be a traffic jam. It would back up, very little would get through, you'd lose a lot, it just doesn't work. So you do the china cap first, and you do the chinois second. Now, I'm not going to be able to hold this and do it at the same time, so I'm going to have to put the phone down, I have to stop, strain it, and then show you. But I will just show you one other thing here. 2 old crummy pots. This is the kind of pot that when you go off to college, your parents say, I don't use these anymore, take them. I don't use them anymore to cook, but if you make a lot of stock, you're going to have to be moving liquid from pot to pot all the time. It's just part of stock making. And so otherwise useless pots that can hold a lot of liquid are in fact useful, and that's why I keep these around, and that's what they're going to be used for tonight. Okay, so this is what the first pass looks like. I actually didn't get through it all, but you see all those solids get trapped in the china cap. The liquid goes through. There's still a little bit more in the pan, in the pot. I'm going to have to pour it out. All this stuff is really very hot, and it doesn't have much of a use. There is a tradition in France called a remoulade, which is you can make the, all of these aromatics and the meats and the bones that you use, you can make another stock from. It's not really a stock. It's like a sort of lame denuded version of a stock because most of the flavor has come out. But this is just another way of using everything to the max. So you can make a kind of weaker stock for other uses if you're going to do that. I've done it in the past. I don't do it very often. So essentially, this veg and this meat and these bones just get thrown out. Humans don't want to eat them. I can testify that dogs do. I had an experience once when I was at my parents' house. Made a gigantic amount of beef stock for my mother. I thought I had secured everything and thrown it away. Somehow, my parents' dogs managed to tip over the garbage can and get into it and eat the beef shank that was in there. And dogs are not cats. Cats will eat, they'll stop being hungry, and then they'll just go do something else. Dogs will eat themselves to death. Thankfully, these dogs didn't quite eat themselves to death, but they did eat themselves into a food coma such that their bellies looked so distended. They looked like they had swallowed an entire bowling ball, and it took them a day or two to recover. Since then, we've been much, much, much more careful about discarding the remnants of stock making. So there's not, as I said, not much you can do with this. Really, you can make a weaker version of the stock or just throw it out. Okay, so we've passed it through the china cap once. You can see some big pieces went over the side. It's inevitable. So really what this means you need to do is pass it through the china cap again, which is a pain, but this is why you have 2 pots and you're just moving things back and forth. Also, anytime you move something into one pot and then you use another pot, you've got to clean the pot, which makes this all take longer. But if you don't, you're essentially not getting the best out of your straining. You're trying to get things out of the stock. So if stuff sticks to the side of the pan and it goes over and it's in there and you don't want it, you got to get it out of there. You're trying to cleanse, purify, and strain the stock of all of its extraneous particles. So we're going to pass this through the china cap one more time. And you can see that was a good decision and the right decision because look at that gunk, right? That's gunk that the china cap can catch. Obviously the chinois would also catch it, but the chinois is not meant to catch pieces this big. It's meant to catch pieces a lot smaller than that. By the way, I'm shaking it because you should always shake stuff in a china cap or a chinois, because when you shake it or swirl it, liquid will pour out, and the more liquid you can get out, that's more stuff that's useful to you. some recipes will call for you to press on solids with the back of a wooden spoon to get the liquid out. Thomas Keller, who I do think is a great chef and a genius, says never do that. I'm in the middle. When I'm making an extremely refined sauce, I don't do it. If I'm making a more rustic sauce, I do it, because the fact is there is flavor in those solids that you can press out. So to be, for lack of a better distinction, basically when I'm making French type food, I don't do it. When I'm making Italian type food, I do it. Keller is a French chef. His restaurant's called the French Laundry after all. And he wants to make the most ultra-refined type food possible. So I don't endorse the blanket condemnation of pressing solids with the back of a wooden spoon. But for this, which is meant to be a fairly refined French demi-glace, I'm not going to do it. Okay, now we're going to take the twice strained through the china cap, the stock twice strained through the china cap, and we're going to put it through the chinois. And again, this is a very fine mesh strainer, and it's going to catch all kinds of microscopic particles. We've gotten all the big chunks out. Now we want to catch the little stuff. Now you can see what I mean about the traffic jam. So even though all the big stuff is gone, all that grit and sand and gunk is there, and it prevents what's the remaining liquid from falling through. Doesn't entirely prevent it, but it slows it down. If you were to just dump the stock in this thing first without putting it through the china cap, none of it would go through. So you want to just sort of swirl it around, and what will come out, let's see if we can see some of that, some liquid will drip out. You want as much of that liquid as you can get, so you're acting like a centrifuge here. We're probably about as much as we can get, but see, there's still a lot of gunk in there that even 2 passes through the china cap didn't get, and you want that out because it'll burn. It's gritty, and it just it feels like sand when you eat it, so it'll grit up your sauce, and you want the sauce to be as smooth and liquidy as possible.
I remember an episode from Top Chef. I don't remember exactly the specifics, but I think one of the contestants made a soup, a pureed soup, and when you have to go justify yourself to the panel, they had the panel, Colicchio and Padme and whoever else had found the soup a little gritty and says, well, how did you strain it? She says, well, I put it through a china cap. And Colicchio gives her sort of dead even stare and says, but not through the chinois? You didn't follow it up with the chinois? And she says, no. And he just sort of says, okay. And this turns out to be a problem, which is one of the reasons I can't remember if she was eliminated, but she definitely didn't win that round, because his point was, okay, so you put it through the china cap. That's great. You got out all the big chunks. But once it goes through the china cap, you can still make it even smoother. That's why you pass it through the chinois second. And to him, that was a failure of execution, and it cost her.
Okay, so there it is. It's been strained 3 times. There's a lot of fat there. You can sort of see it. To my eye, it looks orange. On the screen of my phone, it looks a little paler, a little yellow. The color is mostly the result of the tomato paste, but there's a lot of fat there. What we're going to do is we're going to chill this in the sink, and then we are going to put it in the fridge, and then overnight it will essentially, the fat will solidify, and we can just easily skim it out. I will say one thing, which I hadn't mentioned before. If you smell this, so when it first starts going, and especially when you put the herbs in, the first thing you smell is cloves. They dominate. The cloves recede, and then the herbs come out. And then over time, the vegetables come out. And only really toward the end do you start really getting a sense of the lamb flavor, the meat and the bones. And that's why you need that really, really long simmer. If you just did this for an hour, 2 hours, you'd only get the initial herbs, especially the cloves and the peppercorns, then the herbs and the vegetables. It takes a long time to pull that flavor out of the lamb and out of the bones, and that's what you're looking for. And that's one of the reasons why we kept this on the fire for about 9 hours. You can keep it on for 10, 12. I didn't think I needed to in a pot this small. And you just go, again, a recipe will say X amount of time, which is fine. But you need to use your own senses, especially your nose, and if you don't smell any lamb, if you don't sense any of the underlying flavor coming through, it isn't done. Once you really start to feel that, smell it, and when you get experience, you do this enough times, you'll start to know, okay, I know this is ready to go. Okay, we'll put this under the heading of safety first. The danger zone. I don't mean the Kenny Loggins song. Those of you who have seen Top Gun will know what I'm talking about. But they harp on this in culinary school. The danger zone is known as the temperature range from 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so just above freezing, to 140, so well below boiling, but much hotter than humans could stand. It's about I don't even know if Death Valley has ever been that hot. This is where this temperature zone, this 100-degree span, is where bacteria, contaminants, and so on breed. So a food that is hotter than 140 and cooler than 40 is safe. Anything in the middle is not safe, or that is to say, the longer it is exposed to that, the worse it is. So our stock is definitely hotter than that, but we want to put it in the fridge, and we don't want it to cool for a long time because we don't want it to descend through the danger zone over a period of hours. So to rapidly cool it, you fill your sink with cold water, put as much ice in it as you can, and that ice just sucks the heat right out of the side of it. Now, in a commercial kitchen, they have ice makers that can produce basically Antarctica every hour or two. I have a fridge with an ice maker that's not bad, but it's not that good. So this isn't as optimal as it would be if I were in a restaurant or in a commercial kitchen, but it's not bad. And you can feel it. Like if I had put my hand against the side of this pot when it was just sitting on the counter, I would have burned my fingers. It's already cool to the touch. So it is just pulling the heat out of the pot, and pretty soon it will be cool enough that I can safely put it in the fridge, let it rest overnight, and it will be safe from contaminants. As I said, the fat will rise to the top, solidify, and we can easily skim it out tomorrow morning. Okay, I think we're ready to put this in the fridge. It'll just rest and chill overnight. One thing that I want to add is that it's important when you notice that all the ice is melted. So that was a whole giant tub of ice. It's all melted. That's because of the heat from the pot melts the ice. You're trying to draw heat out of the pot, which it accomplished. Is that you got to make sure that you fill the water up to, or slightly better, even slightly past the line within the pot where the stock is. Otherwise, that top layer won't chill. And I think I a bit underfilled it. I tested it with my fingers a couple times. I thought it was still too hot. Put in a little bit more water, and the heat drains out. So it's ready to go in the fridge now. That's just one of those things to be careful of. And then we will talk again tomorrow when we take it out, defat it, and we make an Espagnole sauce, one of the 5 mother sauces of French cuisine. But we'll talk about that later. Okay, so it's the morning after. The stock has come out of the fridge. You see that orange layer, like a skating rink? That's the fat. It rises to the top and solidifies. So now we're going to strain it out. I know a purist would say it shouldn't be there. It should have been skimmed during the simmering, but I already addressed why I didn't do that, and this works fine, especially since we're not going to make a consommé. We're making a demi-glace, which is opaque in any case, so it's not going to have any harm. So it might be slightly hard to hear because I got the water going. You want hot water. Take your skimmer. See, it just, that comes right up. And then you want to use the hot water to rinse the fat off the skimmer. See how easy that is? So that you're not, once you take the fat out, you want the fat to remain gone. It just literally just comes right out. Hold the skimmer there, let the liquid drain. Okay. The quicker you do this, the better, because the longer the fat is out, it'll melt. And when it melts, it's harder to skim. And there you have lamb stock skim, no fat. It's a little cloudy, maybe means it was got a little too hot when it was on the stove. But as I said, I don't care. If I wanted to clarify it, I could make a consommé. And I don't want to make a consommé. This is going to be in demi-glace, which is a fairly thick sauce, which is totally opaque, so it just doesn't matter. Now I've got to prep the Mirepoix for Espagnole, which is one of the 5 mother sauces, and is the base for demi-glace. And I will do that, and I'll show you the result when it's done. One other minor point, I measured out what I need to make the Espagnole. Basically, a Espagnole is, or a demi-glace is half Espagnole, half stock, so you have to measure it out. Even when doing so, I've strained it through the chinois again. As Thomas Keller puts it in one of his books, anytime you move a liquid between 2 pots, you should always pass it through a chinois. It's a bit obsessive, I suppose. But look, it's catching little particles. Every time you catch little particles, it's just purifying and refining your stock and eventually your sauce. So even though it means you got to clean your chinois more often, it's a good habit to be in. All right, so we're moving on to the Espagnole stage. This is our Mirepoix. You see bacon cut into lardons, which is strips. To do that, you have to get thick bacon from the butcher. Butter, flour, that makes your roux. Tomato paste, a garlic clove, and then over here, mushrooms, tomato, Mirepoix, the carrot and onion. Notice that they're cut a lot smaller than they were yesterday because this is going to simmer for a lot less time. By far the most controversial thing here is the flour. Now this is how you make a traditional Espagnole sauce. A roux is a combination of butter and flour that thickens the sauce. If we wanted to, we could take that lamb stock and just put it on the heat and reduce and reduce and reduce until it became syrupy, and that's the way the majority, if not the totality of restaurants do it today. They don't make this step anymore. Now, two reasons for that. Actually, the one thing I have left out, I gotta go clip it from my herb garden, is a tarragon sprig, which is something I learned from Chef X. I never put tarragon in Espagnole before, but it really improved it. I liked it. Anyway, people gave up on this step because of the flour, allegedly. They said, well, it makes it taste padded and chalky and so on, and so it's clearer, purer, cleaner. However, a wonderful little book, which I think is out of print, that I highly recommend, from 1976, I think, it's called The Saucier's Apprentice by Raymond Sokolov, who was a Wall Street Journal reporter and a home cook. And he basically codified all the other sauces and all their derivatives, and it's one of the best resources ever. He said, look, the point is, yeah, people say it's the flour, we're leaving it out because of the flour, but they're also saving an extra step. And there is, from these ingredients, you're going to get a lot of additional flavor. You're essentially making stock again with very similar ingredients and extracting the flavor out of it. So when you skip that step, something is lost. And his point, the phrase that I remember is, he said, if you make the recipe all the way through to the demi-glace, a sauce with a true demi-glace base has a, quote, monumental size to it that you can't get any other way. I took that to heart, sort of agree with it, so I may be the last person who does this on earth, I don't know. But also, I think that argument about the chalkiness of the flour is just not a very good one and has never been convincing to me. Anyway, I'm going to make it, and I'll show you how when we start. So we have our pan on the fire, drop a little butter in there, let it melt. It's just to sort of get the bacon going. You don't have to use bacon. My recipe does. Traditionally, though, you would use, if not bacon, you'd use salt pork or something like that. In fact, Sokolov, I always mispronounce his name, recipe even calls for, when you make the beef stock portion of it or the stock portion of it, an entire pig's foot, which isn't always easy to find, but they're not impossible to find. You can get them from a butcher. So our butter's melted, almost quite melted, starting to foam. And in goes the bacon. And you're just cooking it gently, just cooking it for a while before the carrots and onions go in. So the bacon is browned, it's released its fat, turn it down a little, it's smoking, and now in go the carrots and onions. And we just want to stir those around, about medium heat. You want them to get a little colored, coated. Also, it'll, as they release their liquid, you can scrape up some of that browning on the bottom of the pan and coat the vegetables with it and give it a little extra flavor. Okay, our carrots and onions are getting brown. The onions are pretty well brown. The carrots are just starting to take on color. That's about all you need. You don't need much more than that. The fond in the bottom of the pot has come up, as I predicted, and kind of clung to the vegetables, give it extra flavor. And you should be able to smell pretty clearly the sweetness from the carrots and the onions. So now what we're going to do is make the roux. Now, this is not, others would say this isn't a roux. A roux is specifically butter and flour combined separately. I actually do that when I make a velouté. The way I learned this at the FCI, and most Espagnole recipes would say to do that, including Sokolov's, but the way I learned it from Chef X was you do it sans jet. So here's what we're going to do. Butter goes in. Let it melt. Swirl it around and let it melt. Okay. The sans jet method is much more commonly used for a stew, where you need some flour to thicken the liquid. But I learned it at the FCI to do this with the sauce too, and even the FCI cookbook says to do the espagnole this way. I'm sure someone, a partisan of the CIA cookbook, would argue with it, but that's what you got. Okay, now the flour goes in. Sort of spread it around a little bit. Now it's important to cook it, okay? You will get the chalky taste if you don't sufficiently cook the flour. And you do that essentially by sight and by smell. Okay, the flour is pretty nicely browned, cooked for sure, clumped together with the butter. So now, tomato paste, which again, you hear Chef X in the background. Cook your tomato paste. You don't just dump this into the liquid later. It's got to go in, stirred around, and get cooked. So you need a big whisk. This is the whisk that I use, a fairly large whisk. And once the water goes in, but before the tomatoes and the onions, you take this and you swirl it around, making sure to scrape the bottom of the pot to get up as much roux as possible. And you want to incorporate that roux into the water. If you don't, it'll just sit there as clumps. Your stock will have less flavor, but most importantly, it'll have a bad consistency. It won't thicken properly, and your sauce, I should say, it won't become what you're looking for, which is a sauce, which has definitely a much thicker consistency than water. So whisk like crazy, a couple of minutes until you can you don't feel any lumps anymore. You feel that you're still going to feel bits of carrot and onion, but the liquid should look much noticeably thicker after you've whisked it. Then you dump your tomato and mushroom and herbs in, and then you go to the simmer. So the whisking is done. The aromatics are now all in. That has the tomatoes, mushrooms, and the tarragon, and now we simmer it. I think the recipe in my book, I forgot, but whatever the time it suggests, an hour or something, I always find is not long enough, so I'm going to let this go a little bit longer. I think it deepens the flavor and concentrates the sauce more. Anyway, that's all for now. This is going to be on the fire for, like I said, at least 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, and then I will do the last stage. Unfortunately, I have this automatic vent fan that is turned on, and I can't turn it off, so there's this background noise, which is bad. This has been on for about 2 hours. And I checked, the recipe says 1 hour. I don't think it's thick enough. But remember, when you're making a demi-glace, there's going to be a reduction that follows this, so you still have total control over the consistency. So we're going to take the pot, we're going to pour everything again, same process, through the china cap, big holes, then through the chinois, little holes, combined with the reserved stock. It should be about the same amount of liquid, and then you just put it on the fire without anything in it and reduce until the proper desired consistency. So there's the remnants in the china cap, and that is sauce espagnole. It's going to get passed again through the chinois and be combined. That orangey color again from tomato paste. There is some fat in here. I'm not going to take the time to defat it, in part because I think sauce with a little fat is better, but also you'll see when the demi-glace, when the combined liquids are on the fire, you can maneuver the pot so it creates a little vortex, and these sort of orange foam will come up, and you just consistently skim that out with the skimmer, and you can take a lot of the fat out that way, along with other impurities. And there you can see the gravelly, scummy residue that gets caught in the china cap, or the chinois. And here's our two combined liquids in a pot that I know yesterday I said I'd never used to cook in, but to transfer things, except today. My 8-quart all-clad pot I need to reserve for risotto, which since I'm having a large number of people, I need to double the risotto recipe. So I got to use this pot, and it's fine. I wouldn't want to braise something in it and do a serious, but just putting liquid on the stove and reducing, it'll work okay. So here it is on the fire, heating up. Got it on high. When it starts to simmer, I'll turn it down. This is an 8-quart pot, so that looks like probably not 6. It's probably more like 5, 5.5. Now, traditional in the recipe is you reduce it by half, so this would go down to 2.5 quarts. 3 max, and I still don't think that's 6, but that's a lot of demi-glace, considering that for most applications you can just use 1 cup and it'll make a pretty good sauce if you're adding, especially because you'll be adding other materials, although I'm not going to do that today. I'm just going to serve this straight uncut lamb demi. When you're doing the stock in the initial phase, you're not looking for reduction. That's why you want the lowest possible simmer. You're trying to pull flavor out of your ingredients, flavor and body, because the sauce has body. The water essentially takes our mass from the particles coming out and gets thicker. In fact, a really gelatinous sauce. So like if I made a demi-glace and I put a pig's foot in it, it is often recommended, beef stock with a pig's foot, if I could find it. There's so much gelatin in the pig's foot that when you chill that stock overnight, sometimes it won't even be liquid in the fridge. It will look like Jell-O. I remember once going to my
butcher, the organic butcher of McLean. I don't get any money for this, but that is a great store. And asking the guy, I need, do you have any necks? I need to make chicken stock. And he leans over the counter and he says to me, I can do you one better, man. I got feet. Okay, so I bought chicken feet. I'd never done this before. And I made chicken stock with chicken feet, and there's so much gelatin in the chicken feet that when I chilled the stock to defat it, as you saw, it was not liquid, it was like jello. It was functionally a solid, a kind of bouncy solid. The lamb stock, as you saw, didn't get that thick, but it is thicker than water. So first phase, you're trying to pull out flavor. Also, with the Espagnole, it's a little of both. So we had the more aromatics in there, vegetables, herbs, and things, and you're trying to pull out flavor, but you're also trying to reduce it. It should thicken considerably from reduction. Why does stock or sauce thicken with reduction? A very simple reason that water is boiling out or simmering out. It's evaporating out. So water leaves, the particles stay, the thing gets more thicker and thicker. When you get to the demi-glace stage, you've combined your Espagnole and your stock. The whole purpose is, at that point, you're only reducing. There's nothing else in the pan to extract flavor from. You're just trying to get water out to make the stock thicker. Now, because I made the Espagnole, which a lot of cooks skip, there was flour, and that roux, that combination of flour and butter, does help thicken the stock, but not all the way. You still need to reduce more to get some of that water out of there to get to sauce consistency.
But again, even though it says it'll give you a recipe, will give you a time, and it'll say reduce by half. You just do it by consistency. The phrase in France is napper or napon, as I recall. You coat the back of a spoon lightly, so you know it's done when you dip a spoon in. You pull the spoon out, and you use your finger, and you can make a track in the liquid. If the liquid just runs off, the sauce is not thick enough. So I just do it by consistency. I don't know how long this is going to take. It'll take however long it takes. When I feel that it's thick enough, it's right, I will stop. And then you typically notice that we've never put any salt in this whatsoever. You only season the sauce at the very, very end. And the reason is salt never reduces. So if you're going to use this for another application, reduce it some more, you could end up having a very salty sauce. Okay, so here it is. It's probably, that's a little too high. I'm going to turn it down. I don't want to see that much motion. But you need to see some. You see all this scum forming. You just, with your skimmer, take it right out. They look like bubbles, but there's actually some solid particles in there that you don't want in the sauce. And you don't have to just stand here and do this obsessively, but every couple of minutes take a look. And look at that too, not just that bubble, you can see little solid particles that float to the top. So no matter how many times you pass something through a chinois, there's always going to be something left in there. It's inevitable. You're never going to be 100%, but get out as much as you can should be your goal. I don't know how clearly you can see it in the video, but in the pan, so the process helps you in the sense that there's a little ring of gunk at the top where the liquid was originally, but that shows you can eyeball how much you've reduced by seeing where that line is, because that's your original fill level. So we've got quite a long way to go. I'm just showing you that. It helps you, get a sense of how far down. Now, this is still easily more than 4 quarts. I don't like to stay in a big pot like this forever. When it gets low enough, in part because the surface area is too wide, a narrower pot's usually better. And this is the way they taught me to do it, is I'll transfer it to a smaller pot. So when this is low enough, I will put it into a 4 quart, and of course, pass it through a chinois on the way. Okay, I think it's low enough to move to another pot, but before we do, we'll test it. There's the spoon, right? Notice it just coats the back. You can't get that line through it that, parts it like the Red Sea. That means it is not ready. Goes to show you too that even though this looks like it's about half, you got to go by consistency, not by any hard and fast recipe rule. So skim it. I'm going to get the chinois and I'm going to move it to a 4 quart pot. Okay, our sauce is done. I have turned it off. I just had a spoon. Where did I put it? Here it is. Demonstrate napon. So you dip the spoon in, coats the back of the spoon lightly, and then watch. See how your finger leaves a clear track? That means it's thick enough. And obviously, any sauce will get thinner, higher the temp. If you let this cool, it'll thicken like crazy. So it doesn't look like a ton. That's a 4 quart stock pot, or a 4 quart saucepan. So maybe we've got 2 quarts in there, a little under. Like I say, a little goes a long way. I'm going to take a ladle of this and put it in my little copper saucepan. And then when it's time to serve it, I will heat it back up and drizzle it on the plate. Maybe I'll show you the plate later. Anyway, that is lamb demi-glace. Anyway,
When you're ready to serve the lamb, all you have to do is put that tray back into a 400 oven for 5 minutes max. You'll know it's ready when you touch the bone, just lightly. You don't want to like grab it. If it's hot to the touch, like your finger doesn't want to be touching that bone, lamb is ready. And then it's fully rested. So when you take it and you take that 8-rib rack, cut it right down the center, so there's 4 ribs per piece, nothing will flow out. All the juice is still inside, waiting for the diner to enjoy. The original plan was I was going to plate this, make a plate, and take a video of that and show it. And I didn't get around to it in part because, it's the press of events. There's a lot of people here. You're having a good time. You want to get the food out. So I've served it family style. And I did get one photo of the platter, so you see all the pieces that are on that platter. Everybody just takes a platter. You see some fried herbs. I just did that because I enjoy fried herbs. I've got a little herb garden, and my fryer was out, and it had some oil in it from another use. All you do is you just turn the fryer off. I think I turned it up to 250, and then immediately turn it off and drop the herbs in. They cook really quickly. They give a nice little glassy green color, and they're actually pretty tasty to eat. You don't want to eat stems, so you kind of have to de-stem them, but that's another sort of restaurant thing. They'll put something on there just to make the plate look pretty.